Thank you, Miriam. It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Jeffrey Herf. Jeffrey is Distinguished University Professor at the Department of History at the University of Maryland, College Park, where he teaches modern European history. He has published many impressive books on the topic, which you can see and read more about in his bio in the program. His latest book, which he'll be discussing today, is Israel's Moment, International Support and Opposition to Establishing the Jewish State, 1945 to 1949. We at AEN are thrilled to have Jeffrey discuss his book now, both because we're enthusiastic about promoting our members' research and scholarship, but also because at a time of growing concern about the delegitimization of Israel within many quarters, it is as important as ever to examine a time in history when the cause of Jewish self-determination garnered support from diverse and unexpected sources. So with no further ado, please welcome Jeffrey Herf.
Rifa, thank you. Thank you, Miriam. Thank you, the leaders of AEN and Ms. Eisen. I'm a historian of modern German history. I'm a historian of modern German history. I've written about a distinctive tradition that emerged in West Germany called Coming to Terms with the Nazi Past. One of the advocates of that tradition was a German social theorist named Theodor Adorno. Many of you are familiar with his work. And he said that the meaning of education after Auschwitz is that it should never happen again. So while writing the history of the Holocaust and the history of Nazi Germany is something that many of us historians have devoted our careers to, we also, some of us, are preoccupied with what Adorno called this post-Holocaust categorical imperative. And hence I became increasingly interested in the relationship between Germany and the Middle East, Germany and Israel, and in particular with the question of the afterlife of anti-Semitism when the Nazis were dead. So that's been a preoccupation. And then as a faculty member of the University of Maryland and a member of the American Historical Association, I have seen the results of one of the most successful propaganda campaigns of the 20th century, launched by the Soviet Union and then continued by the Palestine Liberation Organization since the 1960s, which was first a factor in world politics and then became academicized. And now many of the falsehoods and misconceptions about the history of Israel that the Soviet Union and the PLO first articulated in world politics and at the United Nations have become part of academic culture in Britain and Europe and the United States. And one of the most astonishing aspects of this propaganda campaign was that the Palestine Arab leadership of 1947, 1948 was composed of Nazi collaborators. And in every aspect, they are a reactionary group, a group of the far right, most famously Jamel Husseini, and others in the Muslim Brotherhood. And so one of the great ideological alchemies of the last 70 years is to turn a movement which has roots in the global far right and racism and anti-Semitism into a darling of the global left, to the point where our undergraduates and graduate students are terrified of being called racist if they support Israel, whereas the people who support Hamas or Palestinian claims of other sorts are free of being burdened with that accusation. So these are sentiments and experiences that I share, I assume, with many of you. And I thought of what I can do best is to work as a historian. So I wrote my first book that's not about German history, and it's about the establishment of the State of Israel and international politics surrounding it. So there are four main themes that I want to summarize today. The first is that while Harry Truman was extremely important for the establishment of the State of Israel, his support for the Partition Plan, his recognition of the state when it was founded, the more important support for the establishment of the State of Israel, the more consequential support, diplomatically and militarily, came from the Soviet Union. It came from Communist Poland, Communist Czechoslovakia, Communist Ukrainian SSR. That, of course, after 1949, when the Soviet Union switched its policy, became a huge embarrassment. And the Soviet Union succeeded fantastically well in suppressing or banishing from, avoiding in world politics the memory of that very brief and consequential period of Soviet-era Zionism. The Soviet Union in 1947-48 had power political aspirations to drive Britain out of the Middle East and to become a major factor in the region. And Stalin thought for a while that the Jewish state might be a Trojan horse for Soviet influence. The British Foreign Office and the State Department thought the same thing, by the way. But there was another aspect to Soviet bloc support. Those of you who've read the works of Vasily Grossman's Life and Fate, or know something about Maxim Litvinov or Ivan Maisky, know that there was another tradition of Soviet foreign policy between 1935 and 39 and 1941 and 47, which by 1947 expressed the emotions of the Second World War, of anti-fascism. So in the persons of Andrei Gromyko and Vasyl Tarasenko and Alfred Federkivich, more about them in a moment, that morally infused anti-fascism was crucial for the Zionist project. And David Ben-Gurion and Moshe Sharett, who I come away from writing this book convinced that they are two of the great political figures of world history in the 20th century. They had a very, very small state, but their insight, their courage, their judgment is comparable to that of Churchill and Roosevelt. They both understood that the window of opportunity was very, very short, and it would last only as long as Stalin persisted in his own miscalculations about the Jews, and they seized the moment. The second point is that the second theme is that historians have not paid sufficient attention. In 2022, historians have not paid sufficient attention to, I'm quoting myself, the emphatic, resolute, persistent, and consequential opposition to the Zionist project from the United States State Department, the Pentagon, and the Central Intelligence Agency. And this was a State Department led by the second most famous and prestigious man in the United States, George C. Marshall, five-star general of World War II, next to the President Truman, the most honored and prestigious figure in American public life. Led by George C. Marshall, who appointed a brilliant, then early middle-aged diplomat named George Kennan, who by then was already famous as the author of The Long Telegram and The Policy of Containment. Marshall and Kennan were emphatically opposed to the establishment of the Jewish state in Palestine. And Kennan wrote important memos, which I'll mention in a moment, in the fall and winter of 1947-48, making the case that the establishment of the Jewish state in Palestine, former British Mandate Palestine, would be a disaster for American national security interests, which were to gain access to Arab oil and to contain the Soviet Union. And the British Foreign Office, the State Department, shared the view that the connection between Jews and communism, well, they wouldn't go that far. They shared the view that there was a suspicious connection between the Soviet Union and the Zionist project. And the over the State of Israel was established in the very same months and year when the Cold War began. So all the arguments for the Cold War and the containment of communism cut against the Zionist project. Third, the support for the establishment of the Jewish state outside the Soviet bloc and in the United States and in France in particular came from liberals and leftists. There were Republican politicians, most importantly, Senator Robert Taft, but also Rockefeller Republicans like the younger Jacob Javits, who supported the Zionist project. But the most resolute, the most vocal, the most emphatic support of the establishment of the State of Israel from 1945 to 1949, both in New York and in Washington, came from liberals and leftists. In this town, in Washington, it came from Senator Robert Wagner, the lion of the New Deal and the author of Social Security Act, and from the spark plug on Capitol Hill, the leader, the most important leader, along with Wagner, of the support for the Zionist project, Emanuel Seller, a Democrat from Brooklyn. Wagner his health was not the greatest, but Seller was the spark plug, a remarkable figure. In New York, the support came from leftist journalists, left liberal journalists at The Nation magazine, Frida Kirchway, I.F. Stone, who many of you are familiar with, and the then left-leaning newspaper called PM, a daily newspaper of the 1940s, and then the then left-leaning, left liberal New York Post. And all of these journalists denounced the State Department, which they said was making common cause with British imperialism and was in the pocket of big oil. One of the early parts of the book examined the momentum in favor of the Zionist project in New York and Washington and around the country, and much of that momentum beginning in the summer of 1945 with remarkable memos by the American Zionist Emergency Council and Stephen Wise and Alba Silver, who gave the memos to the State Department, articles by Stone and Kirchway, letters and memos by Wagner and Seller, all urging the State Department to bring Jamel Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, to trial for war crimes. This was not an idle issue because from May of 1948 until 45 until May of 46, Jamel Husseini was under house arrest, held by the French Foreign Ministry outside of Paris. And American liberals did everything they could to urge the French government to hand him over to the Allied authorities in Nuremberg. One of the most, for me, interesting aspects of working on the book was working in the French archives in Pierrefitte and La Courneuve, where we see the French Foreign Ministry coming to the conclusion that Jamel Husseini, aware of his Nazi collaborationist past, will be an asset for retaining French influence in North Africa and the Middle East. The Allies had him under house arrest. They could have put him on trial. Many of you are familiar with historical scholarship on the relationship between the beginning of the Cold War and the decision not to prosecute various Nazi war criminals and collaborators in Europe. That's called Tony Judt and Henry Russo and I and Norbert Frey. We've written about that in Germany and France. The Husseini case is an example of the way in which the Arab collaborators with Nazism enjoyed similar leniency. And had there been a trial of Husseini in 45 and 46 or 47, I think the history of the Middle East may have been different and Arab moderates may have come to the fore. So that theme of the forgetting of Nazi collaboration and its relationship to the Palestine leadership the leadership of the Palestine Arabs in the Arab Higher Committee, a theme that was so important for liberals and leftists in France, and especially in New York and Washington. That theme is an important part of the book. Let me see, how do we get this to move forward here? These arrows are not moving it. Okay, yeah. That is, Stephen, yeah, this is a demonstration in Madison Square Garden of June 12th of 1946, sponsored by the American Zionist Emergency Council, the American Jewish Conference. It's in Madison Square Garden, and that is one of the banners: "Escape for the Nazi Mufti, but no rescue for Nazi victims." And the American Zionist Emergency Council placed ads in PM, so the connection between the political left in New York and Zionist advocates was very, very evident. I'm going to skip over that to save time. That's Kirchway in 1944. She's a remarkable journalist, and those parts of the book that deal with the Nation magazine's advocacy for the Zionist project and criticism of the Arab Higher Committee are, I think, people will find that particularly interesting. And it will be interesting to see if the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, the TLS, New Republic and the Nation review the book or ignore it, because the book is very embarrassing in one regard, in that it reminds a contemporary generation of the importance of liberal and leftist support for the Zionist project, which people may not want to hear. This is the table of contents for the Nation magazine's The Problem of Palestine and Proposals for Its Solution, which was distributed to every member of the United Nations in the spring of 1947. That's Wagner, that's Seller. Sumner Wells is a very important figure. He was an Undersecretary of State, member of the foreign policy establishment, close to Roosevelt, worked on writing the United Nations Charter, and Wells in the spring of '48 wrote a book called We Need Not Fail, which I discuss in the book, which is a vehement criticism of the State Department and an argument that the establishment of the State of Israel continues the spirit of wartime anti-fascism. The question of race and racism is probably the single most difficult thing that our undergraduates have to deal with, or the worst thing that a young person or anybody in this country really can be called in contemporary politics, is that of being a racist. In the book, I was struck by a speech given by Jamel Husseini. Jamel Husseini is Jamel Husseini's cousin, who was under house arrest by the British during World War II, but then emerged as the representative of the Arab Higher Committee at the United Nations. The Palestine Arabs, like the Jewish Agency, were a non-governmental organization, and both of them received observer status at the United Nations and could speak there. So they were very adequately represented, and Jamel Husseini was the leader of the Arab Higher Committee, participating in the General Assembly and at, when necessary, sessions of the Security Council. In London in January of 1947, Jamel Husseini gave a speech, making about a 25-page speech, laying out the various sins, the case against the establishment of the Jewish state, about the Balfour Declaration, how terrible that was, and how the Jews had no place in this place, and it was a product of British imperialism, and on. And a young State Department official, Lewis Jones, the second secretary of the US Embassy in London, sent the initial text of Jamel Husseini at the opening of the Palestine Conference in London to the Office of the Secretary of State. And so the United States State Department had the text on its desks as of January '47. And then Husseini gave the identical speech at the United Nations in September of 1947. It's a long speech, but I want to draw your attention to this paragraph as to why the Jewish state would be a menace in the Arab world and would be resisted by all means necessary. Jamel Husseini said that the Arab world is a territorial continuity inhabited by a homogeneous population with one national outlook. As such, it is free from serious frictions and a natural bulwark for peace. Homogeneity in race has always been the natural basis for mutual understanding and community of interests, he said. The creation of an alien Jewish state in Palestine means the destruction of this territorial continuity and national homogeneity, and the creation of a running sore that will undoubtedly become a permanent source of trouble in the Middle East. Every single official in every office of diversity, office, and inclusion in the United States today should read that paragraph. They should read that paragraph. It should be brought to their attention. They should know that the leader of the Arab Higher Committee, Jamel Husseini, in 1947, was a blatant racist. That this is one of the founding documents of the nationalism of the Palestine Arabs, and one of the enormous propaganda accomplishments of the PLO in the last 70 years was to obscure the racist nature of the nationalist arguments it made against the Zionist project, and to turn the argument about racism instead on its head and apply it to the Zionists. It was a remarkably successful propaganda campaign, and we here are in this room in part because of that success. That's Jamel Husseini on the left, a very modern man, but a man of distinct views that I discussed. A word about the Soviet bloc at the United Nations. This is Gromyko, Andrei Gromyko, the Soviet ambassador to the United Nations, who in subsequent decades became world famous as the Soviet foreign minister. And Gromyko surprised the United Nations in May of '47 with a speech in which he said, many of you are familiar with it, that it was the preference of the Soviet Union that Jews and Arabs should get along in a binational state. But if that was not possible, then the Soviet Union would support the establishment of an Arab state in former British Mandate Palestine and a Jewish state. And Gromyko and the Soviet Union over the next 2 years were consistent in supporting the partition plan in ways that the United Nations was not. That surprised the United States, and Warren Austin, our UN ambassador, responded with a kind of very careful legalisms and a vagueness about the importance, instead of making a statement in support of partition, of appointing a committee, the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, UNSCOP, which by the fall of 1947, to the great irritation of the British Foreign Office, supported a partition plan. One figure at the United Nations that I wanted to draw your attention to is Alfred Federkivich, and Alfred Federkivich is the gentleman in the middle of the photograph. Alfred Federkivich was elected to be the vice president of the General Assembly in 1947, and he stunned one of the subcommittees of the United Nations in May 12th of 1947, in which he said the following: the bond there was a very close bond formed in World War II between Jews and Poles in their common struggle against Nazi oppressors. And I know, in view of subsequent scholarship, there's a certain romanticism here, but nevertheless, the bond was created, he said, by the Nazis. Polish Jews and Jews from all over Europe, he said, were brought into the extermination camps erected by the Nazis on Polish soil and perished there in the gas chambers. And then he said, I was there myself, and I saw 1.5 to 2 million people burned in the crematorium. So the Polish ambassador to the United Nations in 1947 was a survivor of Auschwitz-Birkenau. And he made the case for an Arab state in Palestine and a Jewish state in Palestine. And he did so in the spirit of wartime anti-fascism. I don't have time to go into the French connection and the Exodus affair. If you want, I'd be glad to discuss that. I want to speak for like Rifa, no, another 10 minutes, yes? Something like that, okay. Yeah. The momentum that was created by the World War II, the Holocaust, a sense in Wagner and others, who was a Protestant and then converted to Catholicism, was that the Holocaust was an enormous shame for Western culture, that it had destroyed a core of Western and Christian culture, and that something needed to be done as recompense, and that the Balfour Declaration was a very important and valuable statement, and the United States needed to stick to it. Wagner made the reference to Munich and appeasement, and so there'd been enough in his views, I'm just quoting Wagner now, of appeasing the Arabs. And during the war, there were Arabs who fought with the Allies, but not the way the Jews fought with the Allies. And that sense, it wasn't enough with the appeasing of Arab conservatism. It was time to make the case in favor of modernity and the Zionists. Well, that momentum, which was also evident in the synagogues in the United States and in public opinion and on Capitol Hill, that was causing great concern in the British Foreign Office, in the State Department, and the Pentagon. And in the summer of 1940, remember, in the spring of 1947, in March, Truman articulated the Truman Doctrine and began the policy of the Cold War and containing the Soviet Union. And Marshall's preoccupation was the strategic center, the main event of those years was Europe. Israel may have been an emotional high point and preoccupied the hearts of millions of people, but the whole Zionist project, and that was a sideshow. The main event was, would the Soviet Union dominate the rest of Europe or not? That was George Marshall's and Harry Truman's major preoccupation. The United States had fought and won the war against the Nazis in a close alliance with Britain and the American. There was a special relationship between the United States and Britain, especially between the political, diplomatic, and military leadership on both sides of the Atlantic. And so Ernst Bevin, the foreign minister, was expressing his great irritation at pleas in American public opinion to open the doors to immigration of survivors of the Holocaust from Europe into Palestine. In September and October of 47, Loy Henderson in the State Department and George Kennan in the State Department brought together high-ranking officials from Britain and the United States in something called the Pentagon Talks, which are of enormous historic significance, because the Pentagon Talks were about articulating the meaning of the containment of communism for the Middle East. And one thing I want to draw your attention to is the simultaneity of the beginning of the Cold War in the very same months as the issue of the establishment of the State of Israel was on the agenda. So this is George Marshall at Harvard giving the famous Marshall Plan speech, or just before. In those same months, where Europe is the focus, that's the main event of American strategic planners. The Zionist issue is emerging. This is Undersecretary Robert Lovett, who was in charge of Palestine policy in the State Department, and that is George Kennan on the right, who by then was already George Kennan, a very, very famous figure. And there you see the Anglo-American bond. That is Marshall on the left and Ernst Bevin on the right at the United Nations in October of 1948. Kennan's accomplishment was to take the arguments of the Arabists in the State Department, the diplomats who had served in Saudi Arabia and Lebanon and Egypt, and who had incorporated the anti-Zionist sentiments of the Arab political establishment, he took the arguments of the Arabists, which could have been dismissed as going native because you spend too much time in the region, and made them a consensus, an anti-Zionist consensus in the State Department. And it was Kennan who did it, who had been appointed by Marshall. So these were not marginal figures. These were not extremists, or these were not, these were among the most respected people in the entire political establishment. And Kennan's memos of January and February of 1948 are typically Kennan. They're brilliant, eloquent arguments as to why in every way the establishment of the State of Israel would be a disaster for American national security interests. And the United States should oppose it, and the State Department should continue to try to undermine, or rather oppose, the Partition Plan and reject it. And in March of 48, Warren Austin in the United Nations gave a speech advocating something called a trusteeship proposal, that to replace the two-state solution with a continued American, British, French oversight somehow of this region that would preclude a Jewish state. That failed. To look at the memos of the State Department and the archives and their public statements, they would not give up. And finally, after the Austin speech, President Truman got fed up with Marshall and Kennan's opposition, and he brought Palestine policy back into the White House. But Harry Truman was up against George Marshall, George Kennan, Robert Lovett, James Forrestal, Mr. Hillenkotter, the head of the Central Intelligence Agency, the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He was up against the rest of the American national security establishment. He had support on Capitol Hill. He had support, but there was one thing that he was not willing or able to overcome, and that was the arms embargo. And Loy Henderson proposed the arms embargo in October or November of 1947. And the United States made very effective use of the Security Council in turning an American-British proposal for an arms embargo into a United Nations arms embargo, which precluded sending weapons to the region. And the problem with that, as Seller pointed out in a series of brilliant letters to Robert Lovett, the problem was that the Arabs already had states. They had airports, they had ports, they had armies. And the Jews before May of 49 were a pre-state organization. The Haganah did not have a state. The British Navy was blockading the coast. So the Jews needed guns. And they didn't come from the United States. They came from Czechoslovakia. They came from communist Czechoslovakia, from Stalinist Czechoslovakia, post-coup, 1948. And when the guns came from Czechoslovakia, the British Foreign Office and the State Department said, you see, we're right. We're right. Zionism and the State of Israel is part of a Soviet effort to expand influence in the Middle East. That's what's going on. So the diplomacy of the summer of 48 focuses on something called the Bernadotte Plan. And that's where Ukraine comes in. Ukrainian SSR had a rotating seat on the Security Council in the spring and summer of 1948, and the Ukrainian representative was Vasyl Tarasenko. Vasyl Tarasenko, I feel a particular bond with Vasyl Tarasenko because he was a historian, and he became the chair of the history department at the leading university in Kiev in the 1950s and 1960s. The Bernadotte Plan, I don't know how clear this comes across on the screen. On the left is the Partition Plan. And you see there that the state of Israel is intended to include the Negev desert. The Bernadotte Plan was proposed by Count Volker Bernadotte, a UN mediator, which would have eliminated Israeli control of the Negev Desert. It was supported by the United States and Britain in the United Nations. And the opposition to the Bernadotte Plan came from Vasyl Tarasenko, the gentleman on the left of the screen, sitting next to Andrei Gromyko, and opposed by Noel Baker and Warren Austin, who is to the right, not on the screen, speaking for Britain and the United States. And when in the summer of 48, Vasyl Tarasenko and Andrei Gromyko made arguments for against the Bernadotte Plan, the arguments that they made were in support of the arguments being made by Abba Eban and Moshe Sherrod, speaking for Israel. All of this became enormously embarrassing for the Soviet Union after 1940, the fall of 49. But I bring it up today because of Vladimir Putin's lies about Ukrainians' Nazism. And it's important to remember this episode of Ukrainian anti-fascism and support for the Zionist project. I conclude with this anecdote. I assume many of you are familiar with James McDonald, who was the first American ambassador to the state of Israel, appointed by Harry Truman. The president appointed McDonald because he was the only diplomat, high-ranking diplomat in the State Department who actually was in support of the Zionist project. And Ben-Gurion and Sherrod had a good relationship with him. He spoke with them in May of 49, after Israel had been admitted to the United Nations. But then Secretary of State Dean Rusk was unhappy with Ben-Gurion and Sherrod because they did not agree that the Palestine refugees from the very recent war should be able to return before there was a peace agreement. And they insisted on a peace agreement first. What sense does it make to have them return if they're at war with us? And the State Department then sent a letter saying, given all the United States has done for Israel in the last several years, we think it is incumbent upon you to basically do what we want you to do. And McDonald gave the letter to Ben-Gurion and Sherrod. And Ben-Gurion, according to McDonald's notes, said something along the following lines. When the partition plan was proposed, the United States opposed it. The United States then imposed an arms embargo when we needed the arms. Then you supported the Bernadotte Plan. And then Ben-Gurion said to McDonald, if we had to depend, we, the Jews, then Israel, had to depend upon you, the United States, we would have been exterminated. American Jewish community has a lot of romance about the relationship with the United States and Israel. The alliance between the United States and Israel began after the Six-Day War, first under Lyndon Johnson and then under Richard Nixon. That's when the alliance really began. And in the first 2 decades, Israel's most important ally, after the Soviet Union had turned against it, was France. And the alliance with France was inspired by the legacy of the French resistance and by the French left and by those Gaullists who were also pro-Zionist. So all of this, in my view, is extremely important that students and faculty on campuses today read this book. Because so much of what young liberal and left-leaning students think happened is false. And they find themselves in the position of declaring themselves in favor of social justice when the people who began the opposition to the Zionist project in the Arab Higher Committee came out of the extreme right. which is obvious when one reads the Hamas covenant. And but on a positive note, let me end on a positive note. It is absolutely astonishing that the state of Israel was created. And over time, I think more and more historians will come to appreciate the stature of people like Ben-Gurion and Sherrod, who seized the moment, who understood the relationship between politics and diplomacy and war, and understood that there was a very short period of time when the memories of the Holocaust and the memories of the Second World War were still powerful enough to overwhelm the new realities and new sentiments and passions of the Cold War. And what made Harry Truman so exceptional was that he was the only leading political figure of his administration who was both a Cold Warrior and a Zionist. There was no one else other than his lawyer, Clark Clifford. So there's a lot in the book that I think people will find to be new, I hope interesting, and I also think important for the issues that the Academic Engagement Network presents. I spoke a little longer than I anticipated, but how much time do we have for questions? Yes.
Thank you so much. Hugely valuable. I would love to talk to you.
Diane, we're going to give you a microphone here.
Thanks so much. I found it so interesting and so valuable. And as I was just remarking to Rob, especially for today's college students and law students who both of us teach,
Where do you teach?
I teach, I live in Los Angeles, teach remotely at the Southern University Law Center in Baton Rouge. Rob teaches at IU. The events that you're describing might as well be the parting of the Red Sea for as long ago as it seems to today's students,
Yeah.
right? This is barely in the memory of their grandparents, right? And it's not well known. I wonder if you would talk for a couple of minutes. I mean, I could not agree with you more that this propaganda war was, I'd say, won by the PLO, lost by Israel or supporters of Israel. How do you account for that? Do you have thoughts about that?
Arithmetic.
Say more.
Arithmetic. There are very few Jews in the world. What, 17 million now? And there are 11 billion people on the planet. 5 Arab states invaded. There are 50 states in the Islamic State organization. There are 20 states at all, and that are in the region. So I think sheer numbers matters a great deal for that victory. And the oil weapon that the Arabs could wield over other developing third world countries was important. The lack of knowledge of history. The phrase ideological alchemy is that Yasser Arafat and even more so Hamas emerged as phenomenon of the global left is ridiculous. It's just an absurdity. The Israelis, they fought like lions at the United Nations. And a previous book on undeclared wars with Israel is about the Israeli. A lot of it is about the Israeli diplomats at the United Nations. But when you look at what Chaim Herzog and other ambassadors were doing, they were up against it. They were overwhelmed numerically again and again and again. And there was Daniel Moynihan, but there weren't a lot of Daniel Moynihans. There weren't a lot of non-Israeli diplomats who gave that kind of stem winder of a speech that Moynihan gave. He was remarkable. So when you're small in numbers, you tend to lose. And of course, the anti-Semitic propaganda is about how powerful Israel is and how it runs everything, and the Jews run this and the Jews run that. But the reality of numbers and small size, I think that made a huge difference. And and then the Soviet Union was able to and terrorism. I think the blackmail on Western Europe was important. I think the PLO saying, you see what we can do. You know what we can do. We've done it. We'll do it again. We're not kidding around. And so Arafat could speak that way, and then he could speak the other way about how nice we are and how we want peace. So all those things factored in, and then my generation in the New Left was Israel was just on the wrong side of the battle of the Third World against global imperialism. And it had the temerity to win the war of 1967 when the United States was bogged down in Vietnam. So this didn't fit. I still remember at Madison in 1967 when the historian George Mossey, who was beloved as a liberal anti-Vietnam War professor and historian of anti-Semitism and Nazism, came to Hillel in Madison. So the campus left showed up, and we were there, and we expected George to denounce Israel's imperialism and its horrible defeat of the Arabs. And he gave a passionate defense of Israel, and people's jaws dropped. What? Mossey is a Zionist? How can that be? He's a liberal. He's a left. So all those things contributed, and so I've done what I could. I've done what I could. As the legal issues are very important, and I hope you find that interesting, because the non-indictment of Husseini that's a chapter in the early history of the Cold War. People talk about wanted to reconstruct Germany, and the French had their Vichy syndrome, and there was all this stuff about avoiding bringing people to trial because we're now confronting the commies and we don't want to focus on the Nazis. That applied to the Middle East as well. Yeah.
I just want to turn back the clock a little bit further than where you started in terms of the origins, because how much I've always thought that, the alliance that you suggested with Israel from 1967 on was really an alliance between the Department of Defense and Israel. And the state has always been anti-Israel to this day. And it's a continuum that as I see, goes all the way back to the Roosevelt administration. In other words, the West, the United States and Britain were okay with Nazis until the Russians started to win the war.
I think that goes too far.
A little bit possible.
Anthony Blinken, I taught at Harvard early in my career as a lecturer. Tony Blinken was in one of my students. So today's State Department is not anti-Israel. It may not be quite as enthusiastic about some aspects of Israel as people would like, but it's not anti-Israel.
But the United States was okay with Germans, okay with the Nazis as long as they were fighting the Soviets.
No.
You don't think?
No, not at all. No, that's just not right. That's a whole other subject. I've given many lectures about that, about the Second World War. But Hitler might have won the war if it hadn't been for Franklin Roosevelt. No, and that needs to be said again and again and again, especially in view of decades of nonsense about how terrible Franklin Roosevelt was regarding the Jews. So believe me, Roosevelt was the best that you were going to get out of an anti-Semitic country like the United States in the 1930s and 40s. In the back there. Yeah.
So, appreciate your talk. Thank you. But there is, as you said, there is sort of an amnesia about history and a disinterest in history. And so what would be your current through line? What would be your message now that would be compelling generally, but especially on college campuses, to why there should be a sympathy towards Israel ideologically, as a leftist or as a progressive? How would you put that together?
This creation of the state of Israel is one of the most wonderful political developments of the last century. It ended 2,000 years of Jewish statelessness, 2,000 years of persecution and suffering. This is a source of enormous pride and progress. As long as Christianity and Islam exist, there will be people in this world who interpret the Gospels and the Quran to be documents of anti-Judaism. There will be theologians of Christianity and theologians of Islam who will argue that this is not the case, and that there is a close bond between the two subsequent monotheistic religions and Judaism. Robert Wagner was one of those people. Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, they were one of those people. Boualem Sansal in France, he's one of those people. But my friend Bassem Tibi, he's one of those people. But there will always be people, educated and non-educated, who will look to the Quran and the Gospels as documents of anti-Judaism. And so there was and remains a need for the Jewish state. Other people will make more religious arguments for the establishment of the state of Israel. I tend to be a more secular person. But it's an enormous accomplishment that at last the Jews can defend themselves. And young people need to know. And that this put an end to an ongoing act of enormous injustice that would have continued. Yeah.
Professor Herf, one of your slides really caught my attention on Sumner Wells and need not fail. I was under the impression from David Wyman's The Abandonment of the Jews that Wells was just part of that, a very unsympathetic State Department in the late 30s and early
David
40s.
Wyman's book is more about the war in Vietnam than it is about what actually happened in the 1940s. It's not a good book. And I'm sorry to be so blunt.
Well, no,
but-
I appreciate your being
Yeah.
blunt, but my question is, was there a change of heart on Sumner Wells' part? Was he sort of an odd man out in a generally unsympathetic State Department?
Wells was an odd man out because he was gay and because he was also a Zionist. The history of gays in Washington is there's a new book coming out. The author is Jamie Kirchick's book is coming out next month. But we need not fail. As far as I can tell, Wells' preoccupation was with Latin America. But he already by 1945, he was giving speeches in favor of the Zionist option. And for him and that generation, Zionism and the Zionist project was part of the traditions for which the Second World War was fought. And in that sense, he saw a continuity in the State Department policy regarding Jewish policy. Wells did. I offer enough detail in Israel's Moment about Wells' book so you get a sense of his work. The book is now out of print. You can get it on Amazon, but the connection between the New Deal, domestic reform, Roosevelt, liberalism, and the Zionist project, that's an important theme in Israel's Moment. Yes.
I had not known about Vasil Tarasenko
Mhm.
and Truman's, how much opposition Truman was facing.
Mhm.
And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the background of these men, or what was their conception of Israel? that led them to their sort of monumental support for Zionism?
Well, they were the conventional, I don't want to use cliches, but this was the Ivy League. This was the traditional American Protestant establishment. And their connections in the State Department with the oil industry were also close. Yeah, I mean, the kind of business diplomatic establishment had longer and closer ties with the Arab governments than with the Zionist movement. United States, Charles, I don't know how many of you, there's a book by Charles Stember on the history of anti-Semitism in the United States, and Stember looked at popular opinion polls conducted by Gallup and Roper and Chicago Opinion Research in the 1930s and 40s. And they asked the same question: do Jews have too much power? Are Jewish men willing to fight? Do Jews care too much about money? All these kind of indicators of anti-Semitism. And the polls show that anti-Semitism in American life peaked in June of 1944 when American soldiers hit the beaches in Normandy. That's when now it declined after the revelations of the Holocaust somewhat. But it's important to keep in mind that the United States in the 1940s was a society in which anti-Semitism was vastly more widespread than it is today. It was a different country. I mean, I'm looking, people here are, some of you are younger than I am and some of you are not, but you can remember what it was like to grow up Jewish in the 1950s and 60s, some of you. And it was not always such a pleasant experience. But let's leave the anti-Semitism question aside, okay? Let's put that aside. Let's say that all of them would be just delighted if their boys married a Jewish girl or whatever. All that is like that they were all enlightened and they were profoundly influenced by the Holocaust and they were just, okay. The arguments that they made were about global strategy. And the main event, and I'm repeating myself, the main event was preventing the domination of Western Europe by the Soviet Union. And in the Cold War, the CIA supported German Social Democrats, Italian socialists, French socialists, British Labour Party. The CIA made the case that in order to defeat the communists, you could not depend upon Catholic conservatives in Europe to win the Cold War. You needed to have left of center Democrats on your side, small d. They did not make that same, they did not apply that argument to David Ben-Gurion. And they could have. The argument was there. If you want to ally with Bevin or with Kurt Schumacher, then why not with Begin and Sherrod? They were exactly the same kind of people. So this association, to the extent that the anti-Semitism question enters, it is this association of the Jews and communism. That there's it expresses itself in the suspicion about the Soviet Union and Zionism. And the State Department reports from the diplomats working in Prague and Marseille and Genoa are about the efforts of the NKVD to smuggle agents into Palestine in the refugee stream. So rather than expressing empathy and concern about these poor people who are displaced and they've survived the Holocaust and we need to help them, and no, it was, there are these people who come to us and they say, they tell the same story, that they've been in a concentration camp because they're Jewish and now they fear persecution. They keep telling the same story. Then we're not, as if that couldn't be the case. And so there are a lot of reports about communists in the refugee stream and stopping that, because this is Soviet policy to establish a bridgehead in the Middle East. And so Clark Clifford plays a very important role in the establishment of the State of Israel. Many of you, I think, know that. Clifford was Truman's lawyer. And what Truman needed was to hear from somebody that establishing the Jewish state was not going to be good for the Soviet Union. And Clark Clifford said, Mr. President, the establishing the State of Israel is going to create a democratic bulwark in the Middle East. The Zionists are Democrats. The Zionists are not communists, Mr. President. And Mr. President, the Arabs have oil in the ground, but they can't make a penny off the oil in the ground if nobody's going to buy it. So they've got to sell the oil to Western Europe and to the United States. And all this talk about boycotts and threats from the Arab oil producers is just hot air. They want to make money. So, Mr. President, you can support the establishment of the State of Israel. You can defeat the communists. You can win the Cold War. You can support the Zionist project all at the same time. You need a good lawyer. You need a good lawyer. And Clifford was the one. And there's a very famous episode, the showdown in the Oval Office. Many of you have heard about it. There's George Marshall. There's Robert Lovett. There's Clark Clifford, who's now, I don't know if he was even 40 years old then. And that's George Marshall over there. And Marshall said, Mr. President, I cannot support you if you support the recognition of this state. And there's Clifford making these arguments. Not even, I don't know, I don't think he was 40. Imagine that, you know? And the president says, well, thank you, everybody, and I'm going to think it over, you know? But there was a very dramatic moment. And all of the things I've talked about come together in that meeting in early May of 47, when Marshall and Lovett are trying to prevent him making the case against the recognition. There are good stories in the book. A lot of analysis and interpretation, but there's some just good stories.
This will be our last question.
Thanks. Well, thanks for sharing all that. I love the title of the book. I think it's really profound.
Comes from my wife. She's Sonia Michelle. The title is hers. So my brilliant wife. Yeah.
Well, it takes a village. It takes a whole committee. I was wondering, it was a remarkable story, and just also looking at this photo right now, I was wondering if there's a similar or equivalent scholarship about the support from those gentlemen from Ukraine and Soviet Union at that time, and the decisions that, or the influences on them that led to those stances, you know, because you've gotten into, you know, all the details of the meetings and the memos in the State Department and the administration and so forth. And are there people, have anyone looked into all the details on that side?
Laurent Rucker is a French historian who's written about Stalin, what's called Stalin's surprise and the Gromov speech. I don't know of work that, other than mine, that is looked carefully at the spring and summer of 1948 at the UN. Tarasenko, Gromov, Federkivich, they're part of a tradition of Soviet foreign policy associated with Maxim Litvinov and Ivan Maisky from 1935 to 39, the Popular Front, and then 41 to 47 during World War II. In a way, Israel's moment is the last chapter of the era of the Second World War. Zara Steiner, British historian, otherwise known as George Steiner's wife, has written 2 fantastic volumes about international history. One is called Into the Dark, European International Relations 33 to 39. And there she talks a lot about Litvinov and Maisky and this tradition. Litvinov, Gromyko and Tarasenko, they were not executed or jailed after the Soviet Union changed its policies. There's in Putin's Russia, archival work on the history of the Soviet Union and Russia is over for decades to come. My fellow colleagues who do Russian history in the United States, they're finished. It's all going to be a lot of synthetic history based on public sources. But this distinct tradition that came to the fore in the United Nations was a mixture of power politics. Yeah, we want to drive the British out of the Middle East. Yeah, but there's a history of emotions as well. Thanks for your questions.